The cry that came through the door did not sound like my daughter. It sounded like an animal that knew it was about to die. I heard it once, sharp and broken, and my body moved before my mind caught up. I hit the bedroom door with my palm and it did not move. The lock held. The knob stayed still in my hand like it belonged to someone else. My wife reached me at the same time. We stared at that door for half a second, the way people stared at a closed casket. Then I fumbled for the keys. I always wore them. I always told myself it was just being careful. My key ring shook so hard it clicked against the brass plate, a small, stupid sound next to my baby's terror. I put in the wrong key first. It would not turn. The cry rose again, then cut off in a strangled way, and something inside my chest went cold. I tried another key and my fingers slipped. My wife's breathing turned into a thin, angry noise. I finally felt the right key catch, and the lock gave with a soft snap that did not match the panic in the hallway. The door swung inward and the smell hit me first, warm milk and baby powder and something metallic. The room was dim. The crib stood against the far wall, and my son, my first child, stood over it like he had been placed there. He was a teenager then, tall, too still. His shoulders were relaxed like he was waiting for a bus. In his right hand he held a kitchen knife, the kind we used for carving meat. The blade pointed down toward the mattress. My daughter was in the crib on her back, arms jerking, face red and wet. She made a thin, helpless sound that did not even qualify as crying anymore. I saw a small cut on her cheek, a line of blood running toward her ear. It was not deep, but it was real, and it was enough to make the whole world tilt. I did not ask my son what he was doing. I did not shout. I did not try to reason with him. I only saw the knife and the calm on his face, and the way his eyes did not look at the baby like she was a person. He looked at her like she was a thing that made noise. My wife moved before I did. She stepped into the room like she had been called onto a stage. Her hand shot out, fast and practiced, and her fingers wrapped his wrist. She twisted. His arm bent the wrong way. The knife dropped and hit the floor with a hard, clean sound. He did not fight her for it. That was the part that scared me the most. He did not plead. He did not look ashamed. He just watched her, almost curious, like he wanted to see what she would do next. I reached the crib and scooped my daughter up. Her body shook against my chest. Her breath hitched and then came again in sobs that scraped my skin. I pressed my hand over the cut on her face, gentle, useless, trying to make it stop being true. I turned away from the crib and backed toward the door with her, putting my body between her and him without even thinking. Remember this, because people always get it wrong. This house had locks everywhere, but not to keep a child in. We used locks to keep ourselves safe. Behind me, my wife stood between the crib and our son. The knife was gone, but the real danger was about to start. She stepped forward and I saw her jaw set. I heard my son inhale like he was about to speak. And I did not turn back to stop what happened next. When I looked back at that locked bedroom and the knife, my mind always tried to argue with itself. It tried to say it could not have started like this. It tried to say we had missed a single moment, one clear warning, one easy choice. But it had started small, ordinary, even joyful. We had wanted our first baby. We had planned him. We had talked about names, colors for the nursery, and how tired we expected to be, like tired was the worst thing that could happen. The day we brought our son home, I remembered how careful we acted, like we carried something holy. He looked healthy. The nurses told us he was fine. My wife held him against her chest and I watched his little mouth open and close, searching for comfort. I waited for the feeling people describe, that calm warmth of becoming a father. I felt it for a moment. Then he started crying and he did not stop. At first we treated it like a normal newborn problem. We fed him, burped him, rocked him, changed him, checked his temperature, checked his skin, checked his fingers and toes like something small was hurting him. We walked the halls until our legs shook. We drove him around at night in the car because the motion was the only thing that slowed the sound. When the car stopped, he started again, louder, like he had been saving it up. The crying lasted through the day and into the night, and it did not soften with time. It was not the hungry cry or the wet diaper cry. It was a hard, angry cry that sounded like he was fighting us. My wife and I took turns holding him until our arms went numb. We tried to sleep in small pieces, sitting up, waking to that same sound like it lived inside our bones. We took him to doctors. We went back again. We asked about colic, reflux, allergies, ear infections, anything with a name that promised an ending. We changed formulas. We changed bottles. We changed our own diets because someone told us it might help. We learned how to measure medicine with shaking hands, staring at the clock, counting minutes until it was safe to give him another dose of anything that might bring relief. Nothing worked for long. A new trick would quiet him for 10 minutes, maybe an hour if we were lucky, and then the crying would return as if it punished us for believing it was over. Friends stopped visiting because there was nothing to say over that sound. Family offered advice at first, then offered silence, then stopped calling. We stopped inviting anyone. We stopped leaving the house unless we had to. We lived inside the next cry. The worst part was what it did to our minds. In the dark, while my wife sat on the edge of the bed with him pressed to her shoulder, I heard her whispering apologies to him, like she believed she had already failed. I blamed myself in quieter ways. I wondered if I held him wrong. I wondered if he hated my voice. I wondered if some part of me had been unfit from the beginning and he could sense it. We kept chasing help because we still believed effort and love would fix it. That belief kept us moving even when we felt empty. We read books. We called clinics. We asked other parents. We followed strict routines and then broke them because nothing mattered more than getting him to be quiet for 1 hour so we could think like human beings again. After more than a year, the crying finally started to fade. I remembered the first evening he fell quiet for a long stretch. The house felt wrong without the noise, like the air waited for something to explode. My wife stood in the doorway of his room and did not smile. She just listened, tense, as if silence was a trick. When the crying stopped, we expected peace to take its place. What replaced it was watching eyes, a still face, and a calm that did not feel like comfort at all. When my son got quiet, people around us acted like the hard part had ended. They told us we were lucky. They said boys calmed down once they learned routine. In our house, quiet did not mean calm. It meant he watched. He studied us the way a stranger studied a room he planned to rearrange. As a toddler, he tore things apart without looking angry. He pulled books until the spine snapped. He peeled wallpaper in long strips and hid the wet glue under the couch. He dropped toys down the heating vents and listened to them fall like he was testing how deep the house was. If we took something away, he did not cry. He waited until our backs turned and did it again, only harder, only more. The first time he hit my wife, it happened so fast that neither of us understood what we saw. He was still small. He reached up and slapped her face with a flat hand, then stared at the red mark like he had drawn it. My wife froze. I heard myself say his name in a warning tone that meant nothing. He did not flinch. He did not apologize. He only looked bored, like he had confirmed something. School made it worse because school gave us witnesses. Teachers called us into offices with bright lights and tight smiles. They described my son as disruptive, then as violent, then as unsafe. He pushed other kids downstairs. He bit a girl's arm hard enough to leave teeth marks. He laughed when he got sent to the principal because he got what he wanted, which was a room with adults who had to listen. Every time a school tried to set rules, he treated the rules like a challenge. He tore down bulletin boards. He threw chairs. He waited until a teacher leaned close to speak softly and then spit in their face. We sat in those meetings and nodded and agreed and promised to do better at home, even though home already felt like a place we failed every hour. The worst shame was how many people thought it was our fault in a simple way. They asked if we hugged him enough. They asked if we were too strict. They told us to be consistent, like we had not built our lives around being consistent. Some people stopped inviting us to birthday parties. Some parents pulled their children away in public when they saw him. We started to smile more than we felt, just to prove we were not monsters raising a monster. By the time he reached his early teens, it stopped being about broken objects and school calls. It became about what he could do with his hands when he was bigger than my wife. He slammed doors hard enough to crack the frame. He punched holes in walls and stared through them like eyes. He blocked the hallway so we could not pass and forced us to ask him to move. He enjoyed the way we lowered our voices. Weapons entered our home without warning, like a new season. At first it was kitchen tools that went missing, a carving fork, a heavy steak knife. My wife started counting them when she did dishes. One night I found a screwdriver under his pillow. Another time I found a hammer tucked behind the toilet tank. He collected things that could hurt, and he did it with the same quiet focus he used when he was a baby who could not stop crying. The night I got injured, I still told myself it was an accident. He had been angry about something small, a rule, a consequence, a word he did not like. I stepped between him and my wife. He grabbed a metal object off a table, fast and careless, and swung. It hit my head with a bright flash of pain. I went down on one knee, tasting blood, trying not to fall because I knew falling meant I was helpless. He stood over me for a moment and did not look scared at all. My wife pulled him back with both hands, and he let her, almost politely, because the moment had already been won. Outside the home, the stories started coming to us like smoke under a door. A neighbor's cat found injured behind a shed. A trash can set on fire in an alley. A small pile of burned leaves that did not make sense because it had not been autumn. Nothing ever landed on him in a clean, official way. He always stayed just out of reach. But the pattern was there. Cruelty, risk, a need to see what happened next. That was when our house began to change shape, not in the walls, but in how we lived inside it. We bought heavier doors. We replaced weak locks with keyed locks. We kept keys on our bodies like we carried oxygen. We did not lock him in. We locked ourselves away, carving out small, safe rooms where we could breathe and sleep and plan. Their normal becomes planning every day around safety. We checked corners before we entered a room. We listened for footsteps like other parents listened for laughter. People who visited did not understand. They asked why we had so many locks inside a family home. They joked about it like it was a quirky habit. I laughed with them because I did not know how to say, "I am afraid of my own child," without seeing the judgment arrive on their faces. We still tried to fix it the proper way. We tried specialists and meetings and long talks where strangers stared at our son and wrote notes while he sat calm, polite, almost charming. We tried therapy. We tried medication. We tried years of it, swallowing hope like pills. And nothing changed. The second pregnancy happened in the middle of our safety routines, when we measured every day by what we survived. My wife came to me with the test in her hand, and I saw her face before I saw the result. She did not look surprised. She looked cornered. I felt my stomach drop, not because I did not want another child, but because I did not know how a baby could live in a house built to defend itself. We did not celebrate. We sat at the kitchen table with the lights off, listening for footsteps upstairs. My wife spoke in a low voice like the walls had ears. She said she could not go through with ending it. She said it once, simple, final, and her hands never stopped shaking. I did not argue the way people might expect. I only asked how we would keep a baby safe from our son. That question stayed between us for nights. We talked when we could, behind locked doors, with a key on the table like it was part of the conversation. We talked about money, about space, about what we would tell family. Then we talked about the words we had avoided for years. Foster care, adoption, the idea that love might not be enough even for a newborn in our home. My wife made a rule, and it sounded like a promise and a threat at the same time. We would keep the baby if the baby was healthy. If the baby showed the same constant screaming, the same unreachable rage, we would not pretend again. We would consider adoption early, before bonds and guilt turned into chains. Saying it out loud made my throat hurt. Agreeing to it made me feel like a traitor to a child who did not exist yet. During that pregnancy, our son watched my wife's body change the way he watched everything else, like he waited for it to become useful to him. He touched her stomach once without asking. His hand stayed there too long. He looked at her face, not at her belly, like he wanted to see fear in her eyes. When she told him to stop, he smiled, slow and small, and walked away. The months passed in a tight, careful way. We kept locks. We kept distance. We kept telling ourselves we could build a safe corner inside the danger. When my wife went into labor, I felt relief for the first time in years, not because it was over, but because it was out of the house. The hospital room had nurses and doors we did not have to reinforce. For a few hours, I believed we were normal. Our daughter arrived small and loud and pink, but the sound she made was ordinary. It was a cry that rose and fell like it should. She ate and then slept. She woke and then settled again. Nurses told us she was fine, and this time it looked true. My wife held her and started to sob, not from pain, but from something like grief leaving her body. When we brought our daughter home, the contrast cut through me. She looked at us with soft, unfocused eyes, and she did not seem angry at being alive. She did not fight our touch. Holding her did not feel like wrestling a storm. For the first time, we saw what parenting could feel like. It felt like warmth. It felt like hope that did not need to be defended. That hope made me careless for a moment. It made me forget the older child upstairs. My son did not say congratulations. He stood in the hallway and stared at the baby carrier like it was an insult. His face stayed calm, but his eyes did not move away. That night, after we locked ourselves into the bedroom with our daughter sleeping beside us, we heard him walking from room to room above our heads. He was not packing. He was choosing. With my daughter in the house, I learned a kind of peace I had not trusted anymore. It came in small, ordinary pieces. A bottle that ended in sleep. A diaper change that did not turn into a fight. A soft laugh that did not feel like a warning sign. My wife and I moved around her like people who had been starving and finally found food. We watched her breathe just because it was quiet enough to hear it. The relief made me feel sick with guilt. I told myself I should not compare my children, but my body did it without asking. When my daughter cried, it had a reason. When she calmed down, it lasted. I could hold her and feel her relax instead of stiffen. I could fix things for her. That simple fact felt like a miracle, and it exposed how helpless I had felt for years with my son. We turned toward the baby because it was the only place in our lives that did not demand armor. My wife sang to her in a voice I had not heard since we first got married. I found myself smiling at stupid little things, like her hands opening and closing. Then I would remember my son existed upstairs, and the smile would drop, like I had been caught stealing. My son noticed the shift fast. He did not ask for attention. He took it by force. He started picking fights the moment I got home from work, as if he had been saving energy all day. He argued about rules that were not even spoken yet. He pushed past my wife in tight hallways on purpose. He slammed doors near the baby's room, loud enough to make the walls shake, then stood still to listen for her crying. The house filled with daily screaming matches, not my daughter's cries, ours. My wife and I spoke in low voices at first, trying to keep things calm, trying to keep the baby asleep. My son raised his voice until we had to raise ours to be heard. He wanted volume. He wanted chaos. When the baby woke and cried, he would stop and watch us scramble, like he enjoyed seeing us split in two. Outsiders did not see it. If a social worker visited, if a counselor came by, my son could become calm in seconds. He sat with his hands folded. He answered questions the right way. He even looked hurt, like we were unfair. My wife would grip my knee under the table so hard it bruised, trying to keep herself from saying the wrong thing. I learned to speak in careful sentences, because one wrong word could end with my son smiling, knowing he had made us look crazy. Inside the home, my feelings for my son turned into something flat. I did not like admitting that, even now. I still fed him. I still drove him places. I still went to meetings and signed papers and paid for appointments. But the part of me that used to reach for him with hope went quiet. It was like my heart locked a door and lost the key. Distance became our coping strategy, not repair. We kept him busy outside the house when we could. We encouraged programs, placements, anything that took hours off the clock. When he stormed out after a fight, I hated myself for what I felt next. Relief. I began to listen for his footsteps on the porch, not because I missed him, but because I needed to know when the danger returned. I started counting the minutes he was gone as if those minutes belonged to my daughter. I started to look forward to the moment he left again, even when I pretended to be angry that he walked out. My wife saw it in me and did not call it out. She carried her own version. She kept the baby closer. She kept doors closed. She kept keys in her pocket even in the middle of the day. Sometimes I caught her staring at my son with an expression I could not name, like fear and anger had joined together and made something harder. We told ourselves that if we stayed careful, if we kept space between him and the baby, we could manage. We acted like distance was a wall that could not be crossed. Then the baby's room became the place he wanted most, and even distance stopped being enough, because the danger reached the crib. Our keys became part of our bodies. I carried a ring so heavy it pulled at my belt loop. My wife kept her set in her pocket even when she wore a robe. We did not have one lock. We had several, one for the baby's room, one for our bedroom, one for the linen closet where we kept anything sharp, because we had learned that a closed drawer meant nothing to him. We labeled nothing because we were afraid someone would see and ask questions we could not answer. I learned each key by touch in the dark. I could tell the baby's room key from the others by a small bend in the metal. I could turn it without looking, and still my hands shook every time. That shaking did not come from age. It came from training my nerves to expect a sound outside the door. People assumed we locked our son in his room. We never did. I needed to say that clearly because it mattered, even if it did not make us look better. We locked ourselves in. If my son wanted to walk through the house, he could. If he wanted the kitchen, the living room, the hallway, he had them. The locks were for the spaces where we hid. We built safe rooms for the baby and for us, like we lived in a storm shelter that happened to have a crib inside. At night I listened to the house in a way I never listened to anything else. Pipes settling, a branch against a window, the refrigerator motor turning on. Every normal sound felt like the start of something. Sometimes I heard my son moving upstairs and my mind drew a map of his position, room by room, the way soldiers tracked footsteps outside a wall. My wife slept in shallow pieces. When she woke, her eyes went straight to the key on the nightstand before she looked at me. Our world shrank. We stopped inviting anyone over because we could not control what my son would do with an audience. We stopped taking the baby to certain places because we were afraid my son would follow. Even errands turned into planning. Who stayed with the baby? Who held the keys? Which door stayed locked if the other door had to be opened? I felt ashamed that this was our version of parenting, and I felt worse because part of me treated it like a job I had gotten good at. As my daughter grew into a more predictable baby, my son spent more time outside the home. Sometimes it was school programs. Sometimes it was wandering. Sometimes it was friends I did not trust. He would leave without saying where he went, and when the front door closed behind him, the air in the house changed. My shoulders dropped. My wife spoke more freely. The baby's cries sounded normal again. Then guilt would arrive because no parent was supposed to feel relief when their child disappeared for hours. The day it happened started with a fight that felt like every other fight until it did not. It was early, still dim outside. The baby had finally fallen back asleep after a feeding. My wife and I tried to move quietly, but my son was already awake, already watching. He asked for something we would not give him. I did not even remember what it was now, only the speed with which his mood shifted. He stood too close. He talked over my wife. When I told him no, he smiled and stepped forward like he wanted me to repeat it again so he could punish me for it. My wife told him to back up. He did not. I moved between them and he bumped my shoulder on purpose, hard enough to make a point and light enough to avoid leaving a mark. My wife's hands curled into fists at her sides. She did not swing. She just stared at him with a tight, controlled face, the way she stared at a threat in a ring. My son laughed once, quiet, like he had proven we were afraid. Then he stormed through the house, slamming a door near the baby's room just to make her stir. My wife rushed down the hallway with a key in her hand, checking the lock, checking the knob, checking that the door was still solid. We told ourselves the locked bedroom protected the baby. We believed that if we did the steps in the right order, nothing could reach her. That morning when my son finally left the house, I watched from the window until he turned the corner. I felt the familiar relief, then the familiar shame. And while I stood there holding the key ring in my palm, my wife said something that stayed with me. She said, "He always finds a way." Later that day, he did. He found a way in that bypassed every lock. The scream did not sound like my daughter's normal cry. It sounded sharp and broken, like she had run out of air and still had to keep screaming. I heard it through a locked door, and my whole body moved before my mind finished understanding. My key ring rattled so hard it sounded like teeth. My wife was right behind me, barefoot, hair pulled back without thinking. We ran down the hall to the baby's room. The heavy door was shut. The knob did not move. The lock held. For one stupid second, my brain tried to feel relief because the lock worked. Then the scream got louder, pressed tight against the door, and I knew the danger was already inside. My hands fumbled the key. I missed the slot once. My fingers were slick with sweat. I tried again and the metal scraped. The key finally went in and I turned it too hard. The lock clicked open like it was announcing us. I pushed the door and it caught, like something heavy blocked it from the other side. I shoved again and the gap widened. My son stood in the dim room, between me and the crib. He was a teenager then, tall enough that his shoulders almost lined up with the top of the door frame. He held a kitchen knife in his right hand, not raised high like in movies, but low and close to his body like it was part of him. His face was calm, not angry, not wild, calm like he was waiting for a bus. The baby was in the crib, twisted to one side, kicking against the mattress. Her face was red and wet. One small hand reached up and down, like she tried to grab the air. I saw a thin line of blood near her arm, bright against her skin, and something in me went cold and empty. My wife did not gasp. She did not scream his name. She did not ask what he was doing. She moved. Her body went forward with a speed that did not look like thought. One step, then another, straight into him. Her left hand hit his wrist, hard and precise, turning the knife away from the crib. Her right hand slammed into his chest and drove him back. The knife flew. I heard it hit the wall and clatter to the floor. My son stumbled and caught himself on the dresser. His eyes finally changed, not into fear but into surprise, like he had not expected her to be faster than him. My wife stood between him and the crib with her fists up, shoulders tight, feet set wide on the carpet. In that instant she looked like a different person, like the calm mother in our house had been a mask she wore until it was ripped off. I did not go to my son. I went to the crib. My arms reached in and pulled my daughter against my chest. She was hot and shaking. Her cry punched into my ear so hard it made my head ring. I checked her without looking away from my son. I saw the small cut again, shallow but real, and my stomach turned over. My daughter's tiny fingers clamped onto my shirt, and I could not tell if she grabbed me for comfort or if she tried to climb inside me to hide. My son took a step toward us. My wife blocked him with her body and shoved him back again, harder this time, until his shoulders hit the wall. The sound of the impact made my daughter's scream spike. My son opened his mouth like he was about to speak, and my wife hit him. It was not a slap. It was a punch, clean and direct, into his face. His head snapped to the side. He blinked and looked at her like he could not believe she had done it. Then she hit him again. I stood there holding the baby, and I saw the moment my wife crossed a line inside herself. It was the exact second where protection turned into punishment. She had disarmed him, she had blocked him, and she could have stopped there. She did not. She drove him down the hall out of the nursery with a series of strikes that looked trained, not wild. A punch to move him, another to keep him from thinking. She did not shout. She did not cry. She breathed through her nose like she had practiced it 1,000 times. My son raised his arms too late. He tried to grab her wrists. She slipped away and hit his ribs. He made a sound I had never heard from him, half pain and half outrage, like he felt insulted by the idea that his body could be hurt. He shouted my name then, not for help, but like a complaint, like I had broken the rules by allowing her to touch him. I could have stopped her. I knew where to grab my wife, how to pull her back, how to wedge my body between them. I had stopped fights before. I had taken hits before. I could have done it again. But my daughter was in my arms, and she would not stop screaming, and all I could see was that thin line of blood and the knife in his hand. My legs did not move toward my wife. They moved away. I backed out of the nursery, holding my daughter tight, and my eyes stayed on my son as my wife drove him farther down the hall. He stumbled into the wall again. A framed photo fell and shattered. He slipped on the glass and swore, loud and ugly. Then he threatened her, words I could not repeat, promises that came out of him like they had been waiting behind his teeth for years. My wife answered with another punch. I turned and carried my daughter toward the kitchen, because the kitchen was open, because it had light, because it had space between doors. I set her on the table for 1 second just to free my hand, and her scream did not weaken. I grabbed a clean towel and pressed it against her small arm, trying to see the injury without letting my eyes focus too long on it. Behind me down the hallway the impacts continued, dull thuds, a body hitting a wall, a sharp slap of skin on skin. My son's voice rose and broke, then rose again in rage. My wife did not say a word. I stood in the kitchen with my daughter and the towel and the keys still in my hand, and I listened. The sounds did not stop. I held my daughter against my chest and carried her to the sink because my hands needed something simple to do. Her scream had turned into a weak, hiccuping cry that kept catching in her throat. I ran warm water and stared at the towel I had pressed to her arm, forcing myself to lift it slowly. The cut looked small, but it looked wrong on her. It was a thin opening in perfect skin, already swelling at the edges. I washed around it with shaking fingers, careful not to hurt her, careful not to look too hard at what it meant. Behind me, down the hall, the sounds kept coming. At first it was my son's voice, loud and furious. Then it dropped into a rough pleading that made my stomach twist. Then it stopped. The yelling stopped so suddenly that I thought my wife had finally backed away. The hitting did not stop. The thuds continued in the same steady rhythm, like someone worked a heavy bag in a gym. There was no shouting now, no words from either of them, only impact and breath. That scared me more than the threats. It meant my wife had gone past the part where she reacted. It meant she had entered a place where she did not need my son to fight back to keep going. My daughter's eyes rolled toward the hallway every time a sound landed. I bounced her against my shoulder and whispered the same soft nonsense I used when she had a nightmare. It came out flat, like I read lines off a page. I cleaned the cut, patted it dry, and wrapped it with a small strip of gauze from the cupboard we kept for normal accidents. The gauze looked too clean for what had happened. I kept listening. I kept counting the seconds between hits without meaning to. I told myself I waited because I needed to protect the baby, because I needed to be ready if my son came running into the kitchen with another weapon. That was true. It was not the whole truth. Part of me stayed where it was because I could not bear to step into that hallway and choose a side with my hands. If I pulled my wife off him, I felt like I helped the person who had stood over a crib with a knife. If I did nothing, I knew what it made me. I stood at the sink with my daughter and let the choice make itself. When the house finally went still, the silence rang in my ears. It lasted just long enough for me to think, is he dead? Footsteps came toward the kitchen, heavy and uneven. My wife appeared in the doorway like she had walked out of a different life. Her knuckles looked raw. Her lip was split and blood had dried on her chin. One side of her face had a swelling that was already turning dark. Her eyes were wide but not frantic. They looked empty, like she had burned through every feeling and come out the other side. She looked at the baby first. I shifted my daughter higher on my shoulder, as if my body could hide her. My wife's gaze moved to my hands, to the gauze, to the small spot of blood on the towel. Her jaw tightened and her breath hitched once. Then she looked at me and asked a question so quiet I almost missed it. "Is he alive?" I opened my mouth and nothing came out. I had not checked. I had not moved down that hall. I had listened and waited and cleaned a baby and pretended that was all I could do. I shook my head once, not no, but I do not know. My wife stared at me like she hated me for that and like she understood it at the same time. Her shoulders sagged. The anger drained off her face in a single breath, and what replaced it was worse. Her mouth trembled, and then she made a sound I had never heard from her, like a sob that had been trapped for years. She turned away from us and walked to the bathroom. I heard the shower turn on. I heard her breathing under the water, harsh and uneven. She stayed in there a long time. I did not go to her. I kept holding my daughter and walking slow circles through the kitchen, listening to the spray and the pipes and the quiet upstairs. The danger to the baby had ended, but the danger of what we did was beginning. When the shower stopped, the silence felt heavier than before. My wife did not come back right away. I stood in the kitchen until my daughter's crying softened into exhausted whimpers, until her eyelids fluttered, until her grip on my shirt loosened. Then I did the thing I should have done first. I carried her to the locked bedroom and set her down in her crib with my hand still on her chest, feeling the small rise and fall. I checked the lock twice. I listened. Nothing moved upstairs. I left her there and stepped into the hallway. The air smelled different near my son's room, hot and sharp, like sweat and metal. I walked toward the open door with my keys still clenched in my fist, and when I looked inside, I realized how severe it was. My son lay on the floor of his room on his side, one arm tucked under him like it was not his anymore. His face was swollen in ways I had never seen on a living person. One eye was shut. His mouth hung open and the skin around his lips was split. There was blood on the carpet in dark patches, and more on the wall where his head had hit. His chest moved, shallow but steady. He was alive. The relief I felt was immediate and ugly. It was not relief for him. It was relief for us. Relief that I would not have to explain a death. Relief that my wife would not go to prison. Relief that I would not have to tell anyone that our home had turned into a crime scene. My son made a wet sound and tried to lift his head. He did not succeed. His eyes flickered toward me, and even with his face ruined, I saw it. Not fear, not regret. A cold anger that stayed intact under the damage like it waited. I stepped back without meaning to. My wife stood behind me in the hallway. She had showered, but she still looked stained, like the water only spread the moment thinner. She stared at him for a long time and her breathing shook. Then she whispered, "Call someone." I looked at my son again and thought of what calling someone meant. It meant police, questions, reports, hospitals, social workers. It meant strangers walking through our home, seeing our locks, seeing the heavy doors, seeing the way we lived. It meant people deciding what kind of parents we were. It meant my daughter's injury being examined under bright lights while someone asked how a knife got near her. It also meant my son, on a stretcher, opening his eyes and pointing at my wife. My wife read my face and her jaw tightened. She whispered again, not as a request this time, but as if she forced herself to say the right thing. "Ambulance." I pictured my son waking up in a hospital bed, drugged, bandaged, and still full of hate. I pictured him coming home with papers and plans and appointments. I pictured the same cycle restarting, but now with a baby in the house and a new reason for him to punish us. I asked my wife a question I hated myself for asking. If we call, what happens to her? She stared at me like she wanted to slap me. Then she looked down at our son and her eyes filled. She did not cry. She looked tired. She said I did not stop. I wanted to tell her I did not either. I wanted to confess that I heard the hits continue after his voice went quiet, and I stayed in the kitchen and let it happen. I said nothing because if I said it, it became real in a different way. We stood there, and the house felt like it held its breath with us. My wife finally spoke the words we had circled for years without saying. I am done. There was no drama in it. It sounded like a switch turning off, and when she said it, something in me agreed so quickly it scared me. I had spent so long trying to fix him, trying to manage him, trying to keep the peace. In that moment, all I wanted was distance, not treatment, not justice, distance. We did not call the police. We did not call an ambulance. We did not call anyone. We moved like we acted out a plan we had practiced in our heads. We gathered what we needed for the baby first: diapers, formula, blankets. We moved her crib mattress downstairs because the basement suite had a small bedroom. We carried clothes and keys and whatever medicine we kept for ourselves. We did not pack like a family preparing for a new start. We packed like people running from a fire. The basement suite had its own door. It had a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a lock that faced the stairs. We had kept it empty for years because we told ourselves we might rent it out someday. That night it became our bunker. Before my wife locked the door, I went upstairs and left food where my son could find it: bread, peanut butter, a jug of water. I left it on the counter like I fed a wild animal I was afraid to meet in the dark. I did not check on him again. I could not stand the look in his eye. My wife locked the basement door from our side and tested it twice. She held the key in her fist and sat on the floor with her back against the door, listening. I laid my daughter down and watched her breathe until my eyes burned. Our solution was separation, not treatment, not justice. And once we sealed ourselves away from our own son, the next question was simple and terrifying. How long until he recovered? And when he did, would he come back for us? Years later, when my therapist told me to write it down, I still tried to protect myself with details. I wrote about the locks, the keys, the baby's cut, the knife, the sounds in the hallway, and the moment I stayed in the kitchen and did not stop my wife. I thought that if I laid the facts out cleanly, people would see what I saw. They did not see one thing. They saw 3 different stories, and they fought over which one was true. Strangers reacted so strongly because the facts forced them to imagine the same decision inside their own bodies: a baby screaming, a teenager with a knife, a mother moving like a weapon, a father choosing not to step in. People did not argue about the knife. They argued about what happened after the knife hit the floor. That was where their instincts split. The first camp sounded like people who had felt fear take over their life before. Their whole focus stayed on the crib. In their minds, my son did not just threaten my daughter. He broke the idea of home, and once that happened, the rules of normal parenting did not apply anymore. They treated my wife's violence as a survival response, not a punishment. They said the moment I opened the door, I was not in a family conflict. I was in a lethal emergency. A baby could not run. A baby could not defend herself. A baby could only scream. They believed my job was to remove her from the line of danger, and that was exactly what I did. They also believed that years of trying to get help mattered, not as an excuse but as context. They saw a couple who had begged systems for support, who had tried doctors, therapy, medication, placements, and plans, and still ended up building a house around fear. In that framing, the beating did not come from nowhere. It came from living on a cliff edge for so long that one shove finally sent us over. To them, it was ugly, but it was human. It was the body protecting the smallest life in the house when nothing else had worked. The second camp did not care about our history. Or maybe they cared, but they did not let it change the math. Their focus snapped to the exact point my wife knocked the knife away. To them, disarming my son ended the immediate threat. Everything after that became a different act, with a different moral weight. They described it as a line that had been crossed, because once my son no longer held the knife, my wife had choices. And they did not let me hide behind the baby's cries. They treated my stillness as a decision with consequences. They believed I had not just failed to act. They believed I had acted by choosing to turn away. They pointed out that I knew what was happening in the hallway because I heard it. I knew it continued when my son stopped yelling. I knew it had changed from a fight into something one-sided. In their eyes, my silence in the kitchen made me part of it because I allowed it to continue. Then they hit the part I tried not to think about. They said refusing medical help afterward was not fear. It was abandonment. Not calling anyone did not just protect my wife from consequences. It also risked my son's life and guaranteed there would be no record, no intervention, no barrier between him and other people later. For them, that decision was not complicated. It was morally indefensible. Reading that, I felt something I did not expect. It was not anger. It was recognition. Because I had asked myself those same questions in the dark, after my daughter fell asleep, and my wife sat against the locked basement door with the key clenched in her fist. I had known the danger of what we did. I had just refused to touch it, the same way I refused to step into the hallway. The third camp did not pick one side and stay there. They wrote like they held two heavy truths at once and did not drop either. They treated us as victims and as responsible adults in the same breath. They said the home had become unsafe for everyone long before the knife, and that was not only my son's fault. It was also the result of two parents trying to manage something that was bigger than a family. They believed we had been trapped, and they believed we had made choices that deepened the trap. They acknowledged the reality of fear, not the kind people imagined, but the kind that trained your ears to footsteps and trained your hands to keys. They saw that we had built our life around containment and distance, and they said that was proof we needed outside intervention earlier, before it reached a crib. They did not soften what my wife did. They did not soften what I did not do. They just refused to pretend it was simple. They believed the knife was an emergency, and they believed the beating was harm. They believed protecting the baby was necessary, and they believed we still carried responsibility for how far it went and for what happened after. Sitting with all of it felt like standing in the nursery again, with the door half open and my hand on the key, realizing the lock did not matter anymore. Safety explained our choice, but it did not automatically excuse it. And the most important point, the one that cut through every argument, was this. We were not debating if the baby needed protection. We were debating what happened after. If you thought the worst judgment was about my wife's fists, wait until you heard the camps that focused on duty of care. The next wave of reactions did not stay in the nursery at all. People moved past the knife and the punches and went straight to the one thing my wife and I refused to do. They asked why we did not call for help. This camp spoke like they saw the whole moment as an emergency scene, not a family scene. To them, a weapon over an infant did not belong to private judgment. It belonged to police, paramedics, and paperwork. They believed I should have made the call even if my hands shook, even if my wife begged me not to, even if I feared what my son would say when he woke up. Their point was simple. A baby could not describe what happened, so the adults had a duty to create a record while the truth was still fresh. Documentation could have protected my daughter later, in ways I did not even understand at the time. If my son returned, if he hurt someone else, if we ever ended up in court, a record could have drawn a clear line between him and the crib. They also said something that made my stomach drop when I read it. By not calling, I had not just protected my wife. I had created new risk. I had left a badly injured teen upstairs, unmonitored, capable of waking up confused and violent. I had chosen a situation where he could die without anyone knowing or recover with no supervision and come looking for revenge. In their minds, my inaction was not neutral. It was a decision that introduced liability and danger in every direction. It endangered my daughter again. It endangered my wife and me. It endangered the community because if my son walked out later and did something worse, there would be no official moment where the world was warned. When I read that, I wanted to argue back. I wanted to say I did not have time. I wanted to say I was terrified. I wanted to say I had seen what authorities did when they did not understand. I wanted to say our son had lied before and adults had believed him before. But another part of me, the part I tried to bury, admitted something. I had not called because calling would have made it real to the outside world. Calling would have turned our private nightmare into a public one, and I had already spent years doing anything I could to keep the nightmare contained inside our walls. Then there was a group that did not focus on what we failed to do in that moment. They focused on the years before it, like they tried to find where the road broke. They argued the system failed first. They looked at the long stretch of appointments, programs, evaluations, and medication that never changed my son's violence. They saw a pattern where schools removed him instead of handling him. Services isolated him instead of supporting him. Each new placement promised structure, and each one ended with the same call telling us to come get him. They believed we were left alone with an impossible situation, with no real long-term containment, no true supervision, and no safe option that did not threaten our daughter. In their view, the locks in our home were proof of abandonment by the people who were supposed to help families like ours. They said no parent should have to build a fortress inside a modest house just to survive bedtime. That camp did not excuse my wife's fists, but they treated them like a final symptom. They argued that when support collapses, families improvise. And improvised safety often looked like cruelty from the outside, even when it started as protection. They spoke as if they had watched a similar story unfold in their own lives, where systems moved slow, paperwork moved fast, and violence moved fastest of all. Reading those comments, I felt a kind of bitter relief because it placed some of the weight somewhere other than my chest. Then the relief vanished, because even if they were right, it did not change what I heard in the hallway after my son stopped yelling. It did not change the moment I carried my daughter away and left my wife alone with him. The last camp did not argue about law or services. They argued about the meaning of the word parent. They asked where the line was between a child and a threat. Some people believed violent intent changed the ethical frame completely. In their minds, once my son stood over the crib with a knife, he had stepped outside the protection normally given to a child. They spoke like a switch had flipped. If someone tried to kill your baby, they said, you stopped them. If force was required, you used it. If the attacker happened to be your own child, the tragedy did not change the duty. Others pushed back hard against that idea. They believed parenthood demanded humane limits even under fear. They argued that disarming him should have ended the physical violence, and anything beyond that was not defense. It was punishment delivered in rage. They believed it was possible to protect one child without turning the other into something less than human. That argument hit a nerve, because it touched the truth we never said out loud in our basement that night. We had reached a point where we did not feel like we had two children. We felt like we had one child and one danger. Even now, writing that made my throat tighten, because it sounded like something a cruel man would say to protect himself. But it was also the way it felt in my hands as I held my bleeding baby and listened to my wife hit our son again and again. Even if you believed my son was dangerous, one question stayed sharp in the center of everything. What process should exist before force became punishment? One question kept returning, no matter which side people argued from. What would you do with only seconds to decide? Because seconds were all I had. Seconds to open the lock. Seconds to see the knife. seconds to choose the baby over everything else. And then, after that, more seconds piled up in the kitchen while the sounds continued and I stayed still. The comments started with blame, but they did not end there. They shifted to the aftermath, to what came next, because the story did not end with the beating. It ended with my wife and me hiding in the basement, listening to footsteps upstairs, waiting to learn whether my son would recover, and whether he would come down those stairs. The first night in the basement felt like I had buried us alive on purpose. My wife sat with her back against the locked door until her legs went numb. I kept my daughter close and listened to the ceiling, waiting for the sound of my son dragging himself to his feet. When footsteps finally came, they were slow and uneven. They moved across the kitchen floor above us. A cabinet door opened. Something clinked. Then silence again. I pictured him standing at the top of the basement stairs, staring at the door, testing it in his head the way he used to test every boundary. I held my breath until my lungs burned. The next days blurred into a pattern that felt like a prison schedule. We spoke in short sentences. We avoided the stairs. We moved quietly as if sound could invite him down. I slept in pieces, always waking to listen, always sure I heard the first creak of a step. When I did go to work, I left the house like I left a war zone. I checked the driveway before I opened my car door. I checked my mirrors on the way out, as if a teenager could follow me like a shadow. Upstairs, my son recovered without help. That fact sat in my stomach like a stone. The house gave him time, warmth, and hiding places. At night, I heard him shower. I heard the refrigerator open. I heard the television click on, low volume, as if he did not want to announce himself. Sometimes I heard him packing, one end of the room to the other, over and over, like he practiced being angry. My wife and I left food on the counter and stopped leaving notes. Notes felt like a conversation, and conversation felt like permission. We lived under our own sun like tenants under a violent landlord. The locks kept him out, but they also kept us in. Each time my daughter cried, my wife and I snapped our heads toward the ceiling, terrified the sound would draw him down. The first time I heard him laugh upstairs, it turned my blood cold. It was short, like a cough. It meant he had energy again. It meant he had time to think. Then came the outburst. It started in the middle of the afternoon when the house should have been calm. I heard a crash above us, then another. The ceiling vibrated. A drawer slammed open and shut. Glass shattered, and the sound rolled across the floorboards like hail. My wife grabbed the key so hard her knuckles went white. I moved my daughter into the small basement bedroom and shut the door between us and the stairs, even though that door was thin and did not lock. The noise grew heavier. Something big fell. A table, maybe. Then I heard my son yell not at us but into the air like he fought a thing only he could see. It made the hair on my arms rise. He did not come down. He did not test the basement door. He destroyed what was closest to him and left us to imagine the rest. When it finally went quiet, the silence did not feel safe. It felt watchful. Days turned into weeks. I stopped counting them because counting made it feel like waiting for a sentence to end. My wife's face healed, but her eyes did not. I watched her flinch at small sounds. I watched her stare at the basement door as if she expected it to explode inward. Sometimes we argued in whispers about calling someone, even then late after the worst had already happened. Each time the argument died the same way. We pictured uniforms. We pictured questions. We pictured my son pointing at my wife, and we pictured my daughter growing up with visits and interviews and shame. So we did nothing again. One morning, I realized I had not heard him for a full day. No footsteps, no running water, no refrigerator. The quiet lasted long enough that it stopped sounding like rest and started sounding like absence. I waited until my wife took my daughter to the far side of the basement suite. Then I unlocked the door and went up the stairs slowly, with my keys between my fingers like they could become a weapon if I needed one. The main floor looked like a house that had been hit by weather. Cabinet doors hung open. A chair lay on its side. The phone cord had been ripped from the wall. The living room was worse. Cushions were torn. A lamp was smashed into pieces. There were holes in the drywall, fist-sized and angry, as if he had tried to punch his way out of the room. I kept walking and felt my stomach drop again. There was writing on the walls in places, scratched in and smeared where paint had flaked away. Some words were readable, some were not, but the meaning was clear. I was not forgiven. My wife was not forgiven. The baby was not safe just because we were quiet. I checked his room last. The bed was stripped. The closet was empty. A few clothes lay scattered like he had packed in a hurry and changed his mind. The window was unlocked. The screen had been pushed out and bent. My son was gone. For one breath, relief hit me so hard my knees felt weak. Then fear came right behind it, sharper than before. Gone did not mean solved. Gone meant unknown. Gone meant he could be anywhere, healing in someone else's house, learning new ways to hurt people, telling new stories about what we did. He disappeared, but the fear did not. Repairs took months because the damage was not only broken objects. It was the way every room now held a memory of waiting. I patched walls and replaced locks and fixed what I could, but I could not fix the sound of footsteps that never came. Every time a car slowed in front of our house, my heart jumped. Every time the phone rang, my wife and I looked at each other like we expected a voice we had not heard in weeks. Eventually we moved. We told ourselves it was for normal reasons, for a fresh start, for space. The truth was simpler. We wanted a door he did not know. We wanted streets he had not walked. We wanted the chance to breathe without listening. When people later argued about what happened next, they split again, just like before. Some saw an escape from danger, a family finally freed from a threat. Some saw a child discarded without help, left to bleed, recover, and vanish. Some saw the only option left in a broken situation, where every official door had already closed on us long before the knife. I understood all of them, and I hated that I did. Decades later, I still return to the same question in the quiet moments, the same question that waited under every lock we ever installed. Was my silence protection, or was it betrayal? Decades passed and my son never called, never wrote, never showed up at a door I could see through a window. Sometimes I told myself that was proof he had died. Other times I told myself it was proof he had lived, and that he had chosen to disappear the way a person hid a weapon after using it. Either way, the quiet did not feel like peace. It felt like a pause that lasted the rest of my life. I still heard him in small sounds: a floorboard creak in a new house, a cabinet closing too hard, a teenager's footsteps on a sidewalk behind me. My body reacted before my mind did. I checked locks without thinking. I planned exits without meaning to. Even when my daughter grew up and the danger should have faded, my hand still remembered the key ring shaking in my grip. My wife carried it differently. She did not talk about that day unless she had to. She acted like she could lock it away the same way we locked doors. But some nights I woke up and found her sitting upright, staring into the dark, breathing like she ran a long distance in her sleep. In the morning she moved with control again, like discipline could erase the moment her fists kept going after the threat had ended. Then she got sick. It was not a sudden accident. It was a slow illness that took pieces of her day by day. I watched the strongest person I knew become smaller, not in spirit but in strength. She still tried to protect us, even from her own pain. And I hated myself because part of me wondered if this was punishment for what we did, as if the world kept a score I could not see. Near the end, she asked me once in a quiet voice if I thought we should have called for help that night. The question landed between us like a heavy object. I wanted to tell her yes. I wanted to tell her no. I wanted to tell her it would have ruined us, and I wanted to tell her it might have saved him. I said the only honest thing I had left. I said I did not know. She nodded like she already knew that was the answer. She died with my hand in hers, and even in that room, even with machines and nurses around us, part of me still felt like I waited for a door to open, and for my son to appear, older now, calmer maybe, ready to finish what he started. He never came. After the funeral, I moved in with my daughter and her family. It was the first time in my life that a home felt like a home again. Her children laughed loudly. They left toys in the hallway. They ran through rooms without fear. At first, those normal sounds made me tense. Then they made me cry because I realized how long it had been since I heard a child laugh without checking a lock. My daughter never remembered the knife. She never remembered the blood on her arm. She only remembered a father who held her too tight sometimes, and a mother who watched doors like they were enemies. When she learned the truth as an adult, she did not ask for every detail. She asked one question that hurt more than the rest. She asked if we had been scared of her brother all along. I told her yes. I kept going to therapy because time did not solve it. Age did not soften it. If anything, it sharpened it because the more distance I had from that day, the less I could hide behind panic. The crisis lasted minutes. The moral weight lasted a lifetime. I admitted what I had tried to deny. I did not strike my son that day, but I allowed violence. I listened to it. I measured it. I stayed away. And in the ugliest corner of my truth, I admitted I felt relief while it happened, because for the first time in years, someone stronger than him had taken control. That relief did not make me a monster, but it did make me responsible for what I was capable of accepting when I felt trapped. So that was what I asked you now, because I still did not have an answer I could live inside without pain. If you had been the parent in that hallway, what would doing the right thing have looked like? Would it have meant protecting the baby at any cost? Would it have meant stopping the beating the moment the knife dropped? Would it have meant calling for help, even if it destroyed your family on paper? If you listened to this, and you knew the exact moment you would have acted differently, I wanted you to say which moment it was, and why. I read those answers because they reminded me that people still believed in choices, even when all choices were terrible. There was no neat ending, only the question of what you could live with.